For decades, the world has been haunted by a single, terrifying threat. Tehran would completely lock down the Strait of Hormuz, choking the global oil choke point. They constantly painted a bloody picture of drowning us all in pure chaos. But then, after just one single night of the U.S. Navy lifting a finger, the theatrical curtain finally crashed down. It turns out, the very same villain who arrogantly threatened to sever the world's lifeblood is now gasping for air, crying and begging for a lifeline, just to save themselves. Their faces must be completely shattered. Who would have thought a self-proclaimed superpower could be this incredibly fragile? A straight slap to the face. Are we witnessing the final days of the loudest paper tiger in the Middle East? Leave a comment, paper tiger, right below this video if you think this regime is actually dead from the inside out. And grab a scalpel to join me as we dissect their ultimate nightmare. Think about it. You can't poke a grizzly bear in the eye with a stick and expect it to obediently sit down and discuss the laws of the jungle with you. But that, incredibly, is the exact psychological trap this regime dug for itself. They have gotten so used to bullying small, weak neighboring countries that they completely forgot what it means to cross paths with a genuine war machine. The thing is, the Pentagon doesn't have a habit of sending strongly worded letters of concern when provoked. Washington doesn't have time to bicker. Washington sends firepower. Just hours after their little clown show dubbed a self-defense strike, the entire night sky over the Persian Gulf was ripped wide open. No warnings, no holding back. A torrential rain of Tomahawk cruise missiles poured down, guided by the most lethal microchips on the planet. The Americans don't play the proportional response game. They apply the doctrine of absolute deterrence. Every radar station, every coastal command center that Tehran spent mountains of cash to build vanished from the face of the earth before the guards could even yawn. Wiped out in a heartbeat. It turns out, the military escalation move they proudly beat their chests over as a strategic masterpiece ended up being the most disastrous geopolitical suicide of the decade. Instead of scaring the Fifth Fleet into backing off, they hand-delivered the U.S. Navy the perfect excuse to legitimately lock down the entire maritime region. The naval blockade was instantly tightened to a suffocating grip. The steel trap snapped shut. Right now, even a fly buzzing across the strait would probably get locked on by the radars of American destroyers. And what's the most pathetic part? The very next morning, their high-ranking officials scrambled onto state television with ashen faces. They screamed and cried, pitifully accusing the U.S. of, violating the ceasefire agreement. Ironically, the same villain who was baring its fangs and threatening to set the ocean on fire the night before was now playing the role of a tiny, bullied victim. To put it bluntly, their media roaring sounds exactly like a desperate shriek begging for mercy. You take a cheap bite out of someone, and when every single tooth in your jaw gets shattered, you throw a tantrum. Pathetic. Let's grab our bags and head straight down to the ground reality of the Persian Gulf right now to see exactly what a broken-winged eagle actually looks like. For so many agonizing years, the one and only trump card the top brass in Tehran pulled out to terrorize the world was always the Strait of Hormuz. They endlessly bragged and preached that the moment they felt annoyed, 20% of the globe's oil supply would be instantly frozen. They crowned themselves as the terrifying gatekeepers, the gods holding the planet's most crucial waterway. The brutal truth is, the one currently being choked to the absolute point of suffocation is none other than themselves. A bitter taste of their own medicine. Think about it. You build an entire, massive geopolitical strategy based entirely on bullying unarmed, civilian oil tankers. But then, when the gray steel phantoms of the U.S. Navy menacingly appear on the horizon, everything gets flipped upside down. The giant Iranian-flagged supertankers, the sole cash cows feeding their entire machine, are now lying dead and rusting along the docks in Bandar Abbas, just sitting there quietly covered in barnacles, baking in the sun and weathering the storm. Trade routes are severed into pieces. Goods, of course, can't get out, and those sweet U.S. dollars certainly have zero chance of flowing back in. The villain who constantly threatened to blockade the world is today invisibly placed under house arrest, right inside their own backyard pond, drowning on dry land. But the most expensive, sarcastic picture isn't out there with the ghost ships on the water. It lies deep inside those air-conditioned negotiation rooms. Take a very close look at the faces of the Iranian diplomats right now. Just a few short months ago, they were strutting around in their sharp suits with pure arrogance on international forums, vowing to burn the ocean and sink the entire American fleet to the deep seabed if they dared to approach. And now, their faces must be like pale and sweating bullets, desperately scrambling for a way out. They sit hunched at the peace negotiation table, dripping with sweat, using their most polished and pitiful diplomatic vocabulary just to beg the Americans to open up a tiny little loophole so their maritime traffic can breathe. From the position of a thug holding a knife to extort money, they've plummeted straight down to a pathetic debtor begging the mob boss for an extension. A national-level humiliation. It turns out, when you try to take an economic superpower hostage, you better make absolutely 100% sure you have the muscle to withstand their revenge. The tragedy is, they completely don't. The Pentagon didn't even bother firing another shot. They simply drew an invisible perimeter of deterrence on the sea, and just like that, Tehran's self-proclaimed fortress instantly turned into a massive prison holding their own regime captive. The power they always proudly beat their chests about completely evaporated after just one single night. The brutal truth is, the guy who loudly demanded to strangle someone else is now miserably crawling around, desperately fighting for a single tank of oxygen just to keep breathing. Now, let's grab our wrenches and dissect directly into that fateful night of the airstrike to see exactly what their so-called invincible military might is actually made of. For decades, Tehran's propaganda machine has brainwashed the world with boastful footage of their underground missile cities. They dug deep into the core of the mountains, pouring billions of dollars into fortified subterranean bases, lining up massive, heavy ballistic missiles in endless rows. They proudly beat their chests, claiming to possess an intertwined air defense network, an impenetrable steel shield ready to fry any fly that dared enter their airspace. Think about it. It sounds absolutely terrifying and grandiose at first glance. Looking at those building-sized radars and giant launch tubes pointing at the blue sky, anyone would assume this is an immortal fortress. But then, when the American electronic warfare fighter jets roared and swept across the Persian Gulf sky, that entire blinding halo was extinguished in exactly 1 millisecond. Completely colorblind, who would have thought that on that night, their air defense crews were sitting in their bunkers, eyes wide open, staring at completely blank pitch-black radar screens, while the sky right above their heads was exploding? They were utterly deaf, blind, and locked down by the Americans' modern electronic warfare network. The tragedy is, the Pentagon didn't even bother using World War-style human wave sweeping firepower. They used electromagnetic waves, invisible ghosts tearing through Tehran's protective cocoons, exactly like ripping apart a piece of scrap paper. Dozens of smart bombs and precision-guided missiles slipped through every crack, politely knocking on every bunker hatch before turning everything to dust. Their faces must be like, having no idea what the hell just happened. They threw billions of dollars to build a massive air defense system that threatened an entire airspace. But that entire system was taken down by invisible algorithms, leaving those giant weapons standing still, waiting to die like magnificent bricks. Absolute impotence. It turns out, billion-dollar underground bunkers are nothing more than luxurious concrete graves. Don't forget that the old-school physical deterrence has officially and utterly collapsed against high-tech strikes. You can own a missile the size of a school bus, but if you can't even see the enemy smiling at you from hundreds of miles away, that toy is only good for decoration. To put it bluntly, Tehran's entire system of heavy, expensive hardware and priceless pride was instantly turned into a pile of scrap metal the very second the first bomb touched the ground. Now let's flip open their bloody accounting ledger to see exactly how a hollow superpower actually operates. For so many years, the elite in Tehran have always suffered from an incurable disease of megalomania. Think about it. They are willing to shovel tens of billions of dollars out the window, recklessly pumping money into a network of proxy militias scattered across the Middle East, just to satisfy their delusion of being the regional mob boss. They burn cash to mass-produce swarms of drones, forge countless massive ballistic missiles, and fund expensive war of attrition thousands of miles away from home. In the eyes of the top brass, this country is a divine empire extending its octopus tentacles to dominate a massive geopolitical chessboard. It sounds so majestic and glorious. But behind that fake halo that drains the national milk supply lies an absolute, rotten decay. The ultimate facade. What is the price to pay for these martial arts demonstrations on the front lines? The brutal truth is, while the generals are busy beating their chests and shouting their names abroad, back home, the domestic economy is gasping its final breaths at the bottom of the abyss. Who would have thought the real, their national currency, is now in a free fall, depreciating so tragically that people joke you could carry a thick stack of cash to the market and barely afford a few dry loaves of bread. Inflation is like an invisible monster, crushing every meal, every hope of survival for the poor working class. These little people have to break their backs to bear the entire devastating brunt of international sanctions. The tragedy is, while the regime proudly fires a $1 million missile into the sky just to show off down on the ground, civilian infrastructure is pathetically crumbling. Flickering electricity, scarce clean water, cracked roads, just like a country stuck in the Stone Age. A sickening contrast. But the top officials just keep turning a blind eye, endlessly preaching moral lessons about sacrifice and steadfastness. When the people scream out of starvation, their faces must be like completely deaf and looking the other way. Ironically, they demand the citizens tighten their belts and endure starvation to give up their food for their delusional war machine. It turns out that so-called great power is just a thin coat of paint covering up the rot from within. To put it bluntly, they are squeezing the very last drop of blood from their own people, just to feed a completely empty superpower shell. When you build a massive military empire, but place it on the foundation of empty stomachs, that empire will sooner or later collapse on its own without anyone lifting a finger. Pouring billions of dollars to become the lord of the world, yet unable to provide your people with a full meal. How incredibly pathetic. Now, let's step out of the military bunkers and take a walk on the streets of Tehran. You will distinctly smell the suffocating stench of a society rotting from the inside out. For decades, this regime has stubbornly survived by repeatedly using a very old, cliché psychological trick, drawing a giant monster named America outside the alley, just to force everyone inside the house to hug each other in fear. But then, this cheap magic trick has finally passed its expiration date. The curtain falls. Think about it. You absolutely cannot stuff anti-imperialist slogans or glorious vows of martyrdom into a stomach that is screaming in hunger. The brutal truth is, when your child is crying and emaciated from a lack of milk, a few eloquent speeches on TV about a magnificent victory in the distant Gulf can't be ground up and eaten to get full. The people have finally woken up from their coma. That once hardened shell of unity against foreign invaders is now peeling off into pathetic, decaying flakes. Ironically, the real enemy that is actually strangling their lives absolutely doesn't emerge from American aircraft carriers. They sit right inside the luxurious mansions in the capital, throwing billions of dollars at missiles while ruthlessly slashing every food ration of the commoners. A colossal deception. But human survival instinct always triumphs over lies. When a massive ship is slowly sinking to the bottom, the absolute smartest people will always be the very first ones to throw away their pride and jump into the freezing water to find a lifeboat. Just take a look at their wave of mass exodus right now. It is purely brutal. Engineers, doctors, scientists, the brightest minds are desperately finding every possible way to abandon their homeland and flee to the West. They are leaving behind a rotten system that is beyond any saving. Who would have thought a nation that once proudly touted itself as the cradle of the great Persian civilization has now turned into a giant transit lounge, where the elite are just sitting around waiting to hunt for a ticket out. A brain drained straight to the bone marrow. The tragedy is, the more insanely the regime tightens its iron grip, the more recklessly people run away. Their faces must be like completely shattered as they stand, watching the most exceptional talents collectively spit on the system and turn their backs on them. Even the individuals who once blindly trusted and were the most fiercely loyal are now being backed straight into a dead-end corner. The militiamen who once beat their chests and swore to live and die protecting the regime are now forced to stand in endless lines under the scorching sun, just waiting to buy a single ounce of meat at exorbitant, cutthroat prices. It turns out the so-called patriotism they preach until their throats bleed can't even buy a single moldy loaf of bread. The overlords remain fat, shaking their legs in safety deep inside their bunkers, while the lives of commoners are treated as cheap trash, thrown out to the front lines to serve as literal meat shields. To put it bluntly, the blind faith in the system has ultimately shattered into pieces under the crushing weight of reality. An entire society is now filled with silent, explosive resentment, exactly like a giant powder keg just waiting for a single stray spark. The price to pay is a country that has completely lost its soul, leaving behind only wandering ghosts walking over the massive corpse of a delusional superpower. Absolutely incurable. In the end, the collapse of an empire never truly begins with the bombs or missiles rained down by the enemy to shatter its walls. It begins right from the absolute, ultimate rot deep within the system itself. Think about it. The ghost of the old Soviet Union is now returning clearer and more terrifying than ever right in the heart of Tehran. Ironically, they are blindly repeating the exact same devastating mistake. Their underground armories are always packed to the brim with warheads and all kinds of flashy, expensive missiles. But step outside to the state-run grocery stores and the people can't even find a single moldy loaf of bread to line their empty stomachs. The price to pay is a country completely dead on its feet from the inside out. To put it bluntly, the true power of a nation on the geopolitical chessboard never lies in flashy, colorful military parades, or those ear-piercing, threatening growls broadcasted on state television. True power lies in exactly how long you can stand your ground and actually survive after taking a genuine, heavyweight punch to the face from your opponent. The paper tiger has finally caught on fire, and right now, its ashes are fluttering and scattering all across the skies of the Persian Gulf. Game over. Wiping an entire air defense network clean off the map with electromagnetic storms and tightly blockading the lifeline of a whole nation has never been a joke. It is a ruthless, cold-blooded, and incredibly brutal military art form mastered by the Americans. It turns out, when a genuine war machine gets angry, they don't make noise. They just silently strangle their opponent. If you want to witness firsthand exactly how the U.S. Navy sets up similar terrifying death traps deep beneath the ocean floor and coldly suffocates every single pathetic attempt at resistance, click right now on the video appearing on your screen to dive deep into Operation Hormuz Guardian. We will see each other there.